Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Julie Rio. I'm the Adult Programming and Community Services Librarian here at the Wallingford Public Library. Welcome to part one of the library series on women in American history. In this series, presenter Mark Albertson will feature pioneering women for their contributions to America in the 19th and 20th centuries. These women made their marks in a variety of venues: political, social, racial, human and civil rights, literature, and aviation. Each woman, in her own way, advanced not only the course of women, but society itself. This series will highlight the lives and achievements of 4 extraordinary women. And tonight, presenter Mark Albertson will discuss Susan B. Anthony. Now, Mark Albertson is an historical research editor at Army Aviation Magazine, and he's the historian for the Army Aviation Association of America. Mark is a longtime member of the United States Naval Institute and has authored several books. 1, the USS Connecticut, Constitution State Battleship. 2, They'll Have to Follow You, The Triumph of the Great White Fleet. And 3, On History, a treatise. Mark also teaches at Norwalk Community College. In 2005, he was presented with a General Assembly citation by both houses of Congress in Hartford for his efforts in commemorating the centennial of the battleship Connecticut. Please welcome Mark Albertson.
Good evening. How is everybody this evening? Good. Nice to be back. Been a few moons here. Yeah. Tonight is as Julie offered here, tonight is the first of 4 women to be done. Susan B. Anthony is number 1. Helen Keller will be number 2. Amelia Earhart will be number 3, and Eleanor Roosevelt will be the icing on the cake, if that's how you want to. She's a fascinating character. I mean, they're all fascinating in their own right, but they are, again, these are just 4 of many. And I am going to I'm going to offer another one tonight too when I give this talk about Susan B. Anthony, because Susan B. Anthony was also involved in the abolitionist movement. Harriet Tubman comes to mind here. And so there's a lot of these fascinating women. And keep in mind, too, I mean, what you're seeing at this point, too, is what follows. And I mentioned this in other talks, too, with regards to, like, World War I, even Vietnam, the Middle East, the French and American revolutions. Because what were they? They were the ideas of the Age of Reason and Age of Enlightenment put into action. That's what they were. And there's all these, I like to call them isms that are popping up. Liberalism, democracy, republicanism, secularism, socialism, nationalism, parliamentarianism. And people are taking these different ideas and they're running with them. Well, one's going to be a woman's agenda. I mean, if we're supposed to be a country of equal rights, was that just for men? Yeah. I mean, that's a question that's going to come. Well, shouldn't that be an obvious question here? I mean, keep in mind here, and I'll get into this a little bit, where, yes, Susan B. Anthony with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they become really close. And it's not, they're with the abolitionist movement, and you find here that at one point, that without being tied to the abolitionist movement, the women's rights movement might, I don't say die, might not have advanced as quickly as it did, because keep in mind the plight of women at this point. Many couldn't own property. And at this point too, women being married, if you were married to an abusive husband who's maybe imbibing too much in vitamins G, I, and N, it's hard to get a divorce. And if you can get a divorce, guess what? You don't get the kids, the abusive husband does. And so that's the fight that's going on here. And considering as you get into the 1850s, 1860s, where is the money for these movements? It's with the abolitionist movement, not with the women's rights movement. So the women's writers hitch their wagon to the abolitionists. And again, that brings to mind Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. However, Susan B. Anthony is actually born in Adams, Massachusetts, February 15, 1820. And she will be the second of 7 children. Her father is Daniel Anthony, and her mother is a Lucy Reed Anthony. And her father is a Quaker. Her mother was not. Yet, they are all taught to be self-sufficient, have business principles, but also they're heavily influenced by their father and their mother's social reformism. Interesting. And her father is an ardent abolitionist, which does not set well with the Quaker congregation here. And on top, another impediment for her father, he married a non-Quaker. Married a non-Quaker. I mean, keep in mind the time, 1820, 1822, 1825, yeah. And so the family will eventually move when Susan B. Anthony is 6 to Battenville, New York. And there, her father is the manager of a cotton mill. Keep in mind and as they get into a new Quaker congregation, again the old bugaboos show up. He didn't marry a Quaker. He's an ardent abolitionist. Keep in mind there were many people up north who might have been against slavery, but let's understand something here. Where was a lot of the cotton being shipped out of? Up north? Who was financing some of the cotton industry? The bankers up north? Now you see, there's also this self-preservation here too, or maintaining your profits. That goes along with this. But you are seeing as you get into the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, the abolitionist movement gaining steam. And I'll give you a case in point here. Two of Susan B. Anthony's brothers, Daniel Jr. and Merritt, will go to bloody Kansas in the 1850s. Merritt will actually join John Brown. Daniel will eventually become an editor of a newspaper and eventually become the mayor of Leavenworth. Interesting. Fascinating what you see here. But at the same time here, you begin to see as they're ostracized from another Quaker community, by 1848, keep in mind let's go back to the Panic of 1837, the downturn in the economy at this point. The Anthonys are losing, are almost going to go broke here. They're going to have to sell off all their furniture, get out of their house. One of her father's uncles, who's well off, bails them out. And then by 1845, Daniel's, I think it's his mother who dies, and he inherits money. And so they buy a house near Rochester, New York, and that's where they're going to move to. And they'll wind up a little farm here. And her father later will not only run the farm, but start an insurance company, which Susan will help operate the farm for a short period of time. But again, as they're ostracized from their Quaker community, they begin to have Sunday meetings at the house. Congregational friends, this is called. And they begin to get social reformers, activists, and one of these persons who shows up is Frederick Douglass. This starts a lifelong friendship between Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass. Now keep in mind, in the year 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention, which is a women's rights convention. And then in Rochester, a couple weeks later, there's another women's rights convention, which Susan B. Anthony's father, Daniel, and then her mother and her sister Mary attend. Susan B. Anthony does not. She's at a place called at the Conajahari Academy. She's teaching. This is like 1840. This is 1848, so she's 28 years old. However, that's interesting too because here she's beginning to change. She's beginning to drop thee and thou from her speech. She's now beginning to wear stylish dresses. You know, that Quaker influence is now receding. And she will also join the Daughters of Temperance in 1849. And she begins to publicly speak. She will speak at one of their meetings in 1851. And starting in 1851, going into 1852, she realizes she can speak. You know, she's 31, 32 at this point. And she will be giving anywhere from 75 to 100 talks a year. And she will make a living as a public speaker. Of course, keep in mind something else big happens to her in 1851. She meets Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And that's going to start a lifelong partnership. And this partnership is fascinating because by 1861, you know, these two are going to become Mutt and Jeff here. I mean, really, they're going to be really paired up here. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton will be the intellectual basis of this partnership, and Susan B. Anthony will be the mover and the shaker. Or as Elizabeth Cady Stanton later said, I wrote up the thunderbolts and Susan B. Anthony shot them off. And so by 1861, when the Stantons moved to New York City, Susan B. Anthony will move with them. Susan B. Anthony will never marry, by the way. But she's given a room of her own in the Stanton house. Well, you have to at this point, because the two are mated up together in this endeavor. Abolitionist, you know, the abolitionist movement, women's rights movement, and it's going to grow into what? Suffragette movement. So they're together. But at the same time here, you are seeing, again, when you go back to the early 1850s, the temperance movement, what's interesting here is Susan B. Anthony goes to the state convention for the New York State Convention for the temperance movement, 1852, where she was speaking in local chapters. She's not allowed to speak at the state convention. Women speak? How can we have that? Can't. And so, her and Cady Stanton will start the Women's State Temperance Society in the state of New York. And they're going to push the agenda here. I mean, keep in mind again the plight of women. Lack of ability to own property. And even if a woman has a job, in many states she has to turn her pay over to her husband. And again, she has no hold on the children. The husband does. Women are second-class citizens here. Let's understand that right off the bat. Right off the bat. And so their agenda is equal rights. Susan B. Anthony is a big one for this. Equal rights. Gender, no impediment. Color, no impediment here. And so after that convention, her and Elizabeth Cady Stanton will start the New York State Temperance Society. And they will be ostracized from that society too, especially when Elizabeth Cady Stanton says, well, women should have the option to get a divorce. That's stepping on toes back then. That's stepping on toes. And as this goes on here, and they begin to tie their fortunes to the abolitionist movement. And Susan B. Anthony will meet people like Wendell Phillips. Horace Greeley, the editor, he was an ardent abolitionist. William Lloyd Garrison, yeah. And we're closing in on the Civil War, aren't we? Yes, we are. And another person she will meet is Harriet Tubman. In fact, Susan B. Anthony will become part of the Underground Railroad. In fact, one of her diary entries in 1861, when she helps a young black escape the bondage of slavery on the way to Canada, and she notes in her diary, assisted by Harriet Tubman. So there's some big names that are floating around here. She's also involved in interesting here, you know, trying to become a public speaker, but not only in local events. but at like state conventions. She tries to talk at the New York State Convention for Teachers. This is 1856. They have to debate, what the conventioneers here have to debate the ability of a woman to speak. Interesting how that is. Interesting here what she says about that. She is going to be allowed to speak, by the way. And when she does, interesting what she says. Do you not see, because keep in mind, and this is what she says, understand what she says here. Do you not see that so long as society says a woman is incompetent to be a lawyer, a minister, or a doctor, but has the simple ability to be a teacher, that every man of you, get that, every man of you who chooses this profession tacitly acknowledges that he has no more brains than a woman. That's what she says. She also, in 1857, tries to get the Teachers' Convention to pass an initiative that would push the agenda of blacks attending college. That's considered out of bounds. Interesting what else she tries to do here. She introduces a resolution calling for males and females to be educated at all levels, including college. And that's not going to happen at this point. So it's interesting what she's pushing here. The equal women, early women's rights, equal rights. Again, this is being tied to the abolitionists. One of the reasons why? Lack of money. Who are backing some of the abolitionists? Big name abolitionists. Money people. Money people. And so the women's movement is tied to the abolitionist movement. It's not free yet. Not free yet. Interesting how that is. In fact here, the New York State Judiciary, Susan B. Anthony gets a petition signed to get women to own property. It's laughed off in 1855, 1856, but by 1860, get this, the campaign finally achieved success in 1860 when the legislature passed an improved Married Women's Property Act that gave married women the right to own separate property. Enter into contracts, that's big, and be the joint guardian of the children. However, big advance, right? The war starts 1861. Where do you think people's attention is focused now? On the war. And that bill will be watered down. But it's a start. It's a start. Anti-slave activities. Keep in mind, she had been involved in in a form of abolition by 1837. She was against slavery then. However, keep in mind here, she becomes a New York State agent for the American Anti-Slave Society. Keep in mind here that, again, she tried to organize meetings in the state of New York. Some of these meetings were broken up. Even though slavery at this point is in the South, people up north really don't have slaves anymore at this point. There's still those who find it keep in mind here that with this abolition movement, there was the question, what do you do with blacks if slavery is ended? What happens to them? What happens to them? Some are for sending blacks back to Africa. Abraham Lincoln in 1862 was really not for the abolition of slavery. He was trying to put the country together. He's going to latch on to the Emancipation Proclamation. He's going to help push the Emancipation Proclamation later on. But earlier in the war, no, that's not the agenda here. The agenda is to put the country together. That's what the agenda is. You know what I find fascinating about that? When you look at the North and the Confederacy, the North had a population of 23 million people. The South, 9 million. And yet, almost 4 million are black. So now you're down to a population of 5 million whites. Virtually. against 23 million up north? How's that going to work manpower-wise for the Army? Where are most of the resources? North of the Mason-Dixon line. Where are most of the factories? North of the Mason-Dixon line. Where's most of the money? North of the Mason-Dixon line. And so what you find is fascinating. There was a movement among some whites to have blacks in the Confederate Army. Gee, maybe we'll let them arm the blacks, let them fight, and they can become free men in 3 years after the war is over with. Most people don't want that below the Mason-Dixon line. Up north? Yeah, why not? Frederick Douglass will be one telling blacks, fight for your freedom, don't have it given to you. Join the Army. Do you know at the end of the American Civil War, the Union Army will be 2,213,000 men. It is the largest army in North America up to this point in history. You know, some 20% were from Europe. A lot of them Irish and Germans. You know, the Union Army liked Irish and German soldiers. You know, Americans have this aura about them that they don't like being told what to do. Not so some of these Irish or these Germans. They come from authoritarian society, monarchs. Yeah, they know they do what they're told. Well, before the war is over with, upwards of almost 200,000 black men serve in the Union Army. Don't slaves know don't they do what they're told to do? Yeah, they sure do. They sure do. And this is what you're seeing here develop. It's fascinating here. The Women's Loyal League. Now that's interesting. The Women's Loyal National League. This is an effort in abolition, the abolishment of slavery, which many women are going to gravitate to. It's run by Cady, Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony. In fact, Susan B. Anthony will orchestrate a petition effort. Interesting, for the abolishment of slavery and the institution of amendment to make blacks free. They'll organize 2,000 petition signers, or people are going to carry petitions, and they will get 400,000 signatures. 400,000 signatures. It's calculated by some historians, 1 of every 20 people in the North sign these petitions. It is the most successful petition drive up to this point in American history, and helped form the basis, when Congress is going to pass the amendment abolishing slavery after the war. But keep in mind what else you're seeing here too. As the war comes to an end, Susan B. Anthony is out in Kansas helping her brother with her newspaper. She gets a cable or a letter from Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I need your help. It seems like the wording to go into the Constitution to free the blacks is going to have the word male in it. And the idea here is to give the black man the right to vote. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton's fear is that if the word male, it'll be black men, not black women, black men are given the right to vote, that's going to impede the women's ability to be able to vote. Come on back. I need your help. And she's going to go back east. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton tells her, if that word gets into the Constitution, it's going to take us 100 years to get it out. Now keep in mind what else is happening here. As Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony push the woman's agenda, they're getting a backlash from people like Horace Greeley, Wendell Phillips, and William Lloyd Garrison. No, let's get the black man to have his right to vote, then we'll tackle the agenda of women. Well, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton aren't swallowing that at all. And so you're beginning to see a split develop here. And as that split develops, there's a lack of money here. The American Equal Rights Association, they form this. And they're trying to get support, equal rights. If the black man gets his right to vote, why can't women get their right to vote? And there's even a split developing in the women's movement. Lucy Stone, remember her? Yeah. Louise Howe. And They're moving toward, yes, let's have the black man get his due, get his vote, and then we'll tackle the women's agenda. Well, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony aren't swallowing this at all. And so you're beginning to see a split develop in the women's movement. 1868. Susan B. Anthony with Elizabeth Cady Stanton start a newspaper. It's called The Revolution, based out of New York. The paper will last maybe 2 years. But this is a platform for women to voice their political opinions. Prior to this, the woman's outlet was for, on the printed side, was for with the abolitionist newspapers, or papers that supported the abolitionist movement. Here they allowed space for the women's agenda. And as the money dries up for the American Equal Rights Association and for the newspaper, they hitched their wagon to a guy by the name of George Train. George Train is a very he's a very wealthy man and supports the women's agenda. But he also carries baggage here. He calls into question the mental integrity of blacks. But they need money from someplace. They're hoping that they can change his thought processes here. They're thinking they can change his thought processes. Well, by 1870 anyway, the blacks have the right to vote, but not women. I remember my wife telling me about 30 years ago, she says, there's going to be a black president before a woman president. What happened with that one? Yeah. And so, and George Train is interesting. He leaves the country and goes to Ireland, trying to help the Irish. He'll be arrested and thrown in jail. So that access to money for the paper dries up. And what do you think happens to the paper, The Revolution? That dries up. But by the early 1870s, Susan B. Anthony is somewhat of a celebrity here. She's very well known by this point. Very well known by this point. The National Suffrage Movement. This is going to be divided into two organizations. The National Women's Suffrage Association, which is in the guise of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and the American Women's Suffrage Association, Lucy Stone, Louise Howe. And so what you see here, again, is the split. Anthony and Stanton are pushing for equal rights. The American Women's Suffrage Association is pushing to stay with the Republican Party and make this a national agenda. The black man already has the right to vote. Well, it says so in the Constitution, but what do you think is going to happen later on with Jim Crow and the Klan and so on and so forth? You know what's going to happen there. You know what's going to happen there. And so you're seeing this split being fostered in the movement. Both of these associations will virtually dissolve, but in 1890 they will come together with the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton will be the president of this for 2 years, and then Susan B. Anthony will take over. But as a personality of note in the country at this point, Susan B. Anthony is going to try something else. Keep in mind, by 1869, women in Wyoming have the right to vote. They will follow in Utah in 1870. And so Susan B. Anthony picks up the pace as a speaker, but she's going to try something else. In the 1872 presidential election in New York, her and 49 other women are going to try to vote. They're going to try to vote. At least 14 of them are able to vote. Precinct captains turn the other way, and these women vote. Well, they're all going to be arrested. They're all going to be arrested. And only 13 of them will be released. Guess who's the one who's going to stay in jail? Susan B. Anthony. And she's going to have to be tried. She's going to be tried for breaking the law. And the trial, this is in Rochester, so it's in Monroe County, New York. And as they're preparing for the trial, Susan B. Anthony gets on the horse and wagon and will go to all 29 villages, towns, and cities in Monroe County and give talks. Well, the authorities figure this isn't going to work, so they're going to move the trial to the neighboring Ontario County. So what does Susan B. Anthony do? Gets back on the horse and wagon and will talk in every town in Ontario County. The judge will be a Ward Hunt. Now, Mr. Hunt has been nominated to the Supreme Court. He's not a trial judge. He was a politician at one point, but he was in the New York State Court of Appeals. And on June 17, 1783, the trial begins. And he orders that Susan B. Anthony cannot say anything in her defense until the trial's over. Until the trial is over. She will be convicted. But it's interesting when he gives her the right to speak. And she begins to speak. And it's interesting what you see here. She actually tells him, where is it here? I have it right here. She says, she ignores his repeated pleas for her to keep quiet and sit down. She refuses to abide by those orders. And she will tell him, she said, this high-handed outrage upon my citizens' rights. You have trampled under every foot every vital principle of our government. My natural rights, my civil rights, my political rights, and my judicial rights are all alike ignored. He states she has to pay a $100 fine. She says, I'm not paying that. And she says, if you're going to convict me, I have to serve jail time. I'm taking this to the Supreme Court. He's being nominated to the Supreme Court. How's that going to work? Now, keep in mind, this was a nationally covered trial. This is big. I guess along the lines of the OJ trial, I guess, if you want to call it that. You want a semblance of comparison here. And so she will never pay the fine, and she won't serve any jail time. This is almost like swept under the rug here. Swept under the rug. She will continue to speak, and by the early 1880s, her and Elizabeth Cady Stanton will go to Europe. And they are trying to foster ties with suffragettes in Europe. This will lead to the International Council of Women, when they had their first convention in Washington, D.C. in 1888. Their second convention will be at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. They will have another convention in England in 1898, I believe it is, and they will all, and the directors of this, you know, the big names like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, will be feted to a dinner with Queen Victoria. They will have another convention in Germany, in Berlin, in 1904. And the International Council of Women is affiliated with what now? The United Nations. It's interesting. In fact, President McKinley will have Susan B. Anthony to the White House as a guest. What happened to the Statute of Women's Rights here? Again, keep in mind what you're seeing here. You are seeing, again, after the American and French revolutions, these ideas that have been unleashed. And women are going to take advantage of this to get their rights. It's going to take till 1920 till they can vote here. But it took a lot of hard work, a lot of sweat for women to enjoy, if you want to call it, equal rights. Although that's open to question too. That's open to question too. Susan B. Anthony will die on March 13, 1906 in Rochester, New York. And she's buried in Rochester, New York. She dies at 86. She dies at 86. But it can't be said. And one thing is interesting here, though. You know, you go back to the 1870s, 1880s. when her, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and a Matilda Gage will write a 6-volume history on the women's suffragette movement. And I haven't read this. It's six volumes. It's over 5,000 pages. But supposedly, they marginalize the role of people like Lucy Stone. And so some historians have stated that they've had to go beyond this 6-volume history of the women's suffragette movement to get a more even-handed approach on the movement. You know, when you add people like Lucy Stone into this, of course, keep in mind the split that had occurred. But Susan B. Anthony was really not. She wrote letters and so on and so forth. But her prowess as a writer is from her letters, but it's really Elizabeth Cady Stanton who was the real writer here between the two. But as Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, I wrote the lightning bolts and Susan B. Anthony fired them off. And keep in mind, there were many times when Elizabeth Cady Stanton had left home to travel with Susan B. Anthony, and who's watching the kids? Husband was, but the husband supported her. So the husband supported his wife and Susan B. Anthony, which was big. And so Susan B. Anthony is one of these women that sticks out, again like a Helen Keller, again like an Amelia Earhart, or a Eleanor Roosevelt. And they're all fascinating in their own right. Helen Keller is interesting because she's pushing the agenda of people who are impacted physically or even mentally, that they have something to offer to society. Amelia Earhart, something that men were doing, aviation. And then there's Eleanor Roosevelt, who I like to tell my Democratic friends, when they like to tell me that Franklin D. Roosevelt was a liberal, I say, oh, you kidding? He was a banker. He's a pragmatist, I'll give you that. He was probably the man for the time, I'll give you that. But who was the real liberal in that pairing? Eleanor. And so, for the agenda of women, I mean, these are people who come along and help raise the stature of women, so that by 1920, women have the right to vote. Interesting. Absolutely fascinating. Anybody have any questions or comments? Yes?
The publicists were, okay, I didn't think that, like, horse grilling and all that would be, against the women, because usually after the Civil War, I mean, let's be real, the black man, they did everything against the black man after the Civil War, okay, as you know, so forth. So I would think that they would go for women's rights more than for the black man. I didn't quite understand. I know what you said, but I didn't understand.
Well, women are still second-class citizens here. And so, some of these people were so wedded to the abolition movement, the war at this point, by 1864, 1865, you're getting thousands of blacks in the army, the Emancipation Proclamation, so on and so forth. The women don't have that. Women aren't fighting in the army. Blacks are. And so you better throw them a bone here. And so, yes, you're going to see the people in the abolition movement push this agenda. Let's get the vote for the black man first, and then we'll tackle the women after that. And that's not what Stanton and Anthony are looking for. Across the board, gender, color, no difference. Everyone has equal rights. And so that's going to help foster that split. But yeah, it was. And then what's interesting here, when you go back to the 1876 presidential election, which is a fun election to talk about when you're getting into the Electoral College. Rutherford B. Hayes against Samuel J. Tilden from New York. And you need 185 electoral votes to get elected. Rutherford B. Hayes had 184, Tilden had 165. Oh, who's going to win this? Interesting one. No, pardon me. Tilden had 184 and Rutherford B. Hayes had 165. And so there are 3 states in question here: Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. And each of these states, the Democrats and Republicans said, our candidate won. Well, you can't have an election like that. Now, that should have been thrown back into the House. They put together a committee of 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 1 independent, I think who was on the Supreme Court. Well, that independent decided to become, I think, a Democrat. Well, that throws that committee out. And so the election is still hanging in the balance here. Now you're going to get Southern and Northern politicians together here. And they're going to come to an agreement. The South, this is going to mark the end of Reconstruction. The South wants Union troops out of the South. Okay, we'll give you the White House. Hayes will get the 20 electoral votes. Northern troops are out of the South. But by that time, the black man already has the right to vote. So what happened down South? Jim Crow, further impediments to his right to vote. So, yeah, interesting what you saw here. That was the end of Reconstruction. So it's fascinating here. But yeah, that was a rocky road too, with the black man getting the right to vote, coming out of the Civil War. Fascinating, fascinating. Yes?
It's my understanding you mentioned about women getting the right to vote in Wyoming and Utah. As I understand it, there's Mormons who allowed women to vote, and eventually, due to pressure from the federal government or state, that was rescinded. Did you ever hear that?
No. That's an interesting premise, though. But I think when you look at those 2 states, and it's not just those states, I mean, there's a buildup of pressure here that people are recognizing women have rights. Women have rights. Property rights, co-ownership of the kids. I only use that term, co-ownership of the kids. And maybe even the right to divorce an abusive husband. And so, society is changing. Society is changing. It's becoming more modern. I mean, you're seeing, I think part of this is what you're seeing here. I mean, the Civil War was what, really? The revolt of the planters. And so, in 1865, the planters lose the war. America is now going to that Hamiltonian idea of industrialization, and big finance is going to come. And you're going to see this country change. In 1865, we have 144,000 factories. And by 1900, 335,000. And with this goes the modernization of society. More people people are beginning to leave the land which they were tied to at one point, and they're going into factories. Some people will be able to own factories. And what does that mean? I've got a few dollars in our pocket. I can be mobile. I can move from here to here to here. So society is changing. It changes everything. It changes everything. And people's outlook on their rights. Yes?
Concurrent with that change, women are moving into the factories. So you have the those organizations forming. They're living together. They're
right. But then again, that leads to a different issue.
Unionization.
Right. That's right. And so, in fact, at one point, the national labor, what do they call it? Back in the 1860s, National Suffrage Movement. The National Labor Union. And the National Labor Union was an attempt, like in 1866, to have a so-called movement which would have farmers, workers, African Americans, and women. However, Susan B. Anthony, in really pushing the woman's agenda, there was a strike in the late 1860s, a printer's strike. And here is a chance to have women be trained as printers. During a strike, wouldn't they be called scabs? Yeah. She was so hot to trot here to have women take their place in the economy. Well, that put her on the outs with the National Labor Union. And so there's another split. But yeah, interesting, fascinating. But yeah, this is all part of the society changing due to the economy. But yes, in the early 20th century, if you ever read the book, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, the meat processing factories, Yeah. Yes,
The term suffrage come from?
that's a good question. That's a good question.
Anybody know?
You just take it for granted, women's suffrage, women voting. You know, that's a good question. Yes.
As far as the US and England, were they running parallel, the granting of women's rights together, or did one have more of a head start than the other?
You had a suffragette movement going on in England, you know, and women were taking to the streets, and the bobbies were breaking up some of these meetings. But they kept at it, and you know, women are going to so-called win rights in England too. I mean, England is more of a, if you want to call it a democratic state, even though it was a constitutional monarchy for all intents and purposes. I mean, the monarch really didn't have any power at this point.
Did they ever declare, I mean, they had slaves, did they ever have a equivalent of Emancipation Proclamation in England?
Well, the Europeans give up slavery long before we
I
did.
know, but was it an official statement, or did they just, they didn't really seem to have a plantation?
Well, keep in mind what helped force that issue, the snowballing of the Industrial Revolution. And keep in mind that, you know, indentured servitude is going out the door because now you're having more wage earners. That's what you're having here. And after Napoleon is defeated, and Britain is, for use that term, the ranking superpower with her empire, the Industrial Revolution is really snowballing. You know, the evolution of capitalism. You know, the nobility is being undermined. Monarchs are being undermined. And so the nobility, you know, is giving way to a new clique of rich. And people, again, less and less people are being tied to the land. Serfdom, what's happening with that? That's going the way of the dodo. Heck, even by 1861, the Tsar will get rid of serfdom here. I always found that fascinating.
What was France doing at this point?
Well, keep in mind, by the 1850s, Napoleon III took power, and he's trying to resurrect France as a great power again. I mean, keep in mind what you saw in 1830 in France. The last autocrat, the last absolute Bourbon is out, Charles X, and Louis Philippe of the House of Orleans takes over, and he's a constitutional monarchy, so you can see where France is going. But of course, when Napoleon III comes to power, and he's trying to raise France as a global power, but this time Britain rules India, and so what is France going to do? Get into Southeast Asia. That means Vietnam, folks. You know where that's going to go. But that's what's happening here. You know, at the same time, you've got some of these leaders who want to maintain their countries as premier colonial powers. What's happening underneath? People want their rights. You know? It's interesting what you're seeing developing. And at the same time, what's happening in the Middle East? The Ottoman Empire is being undermined by these same movements. Of course, there it's not as developed as Europe. So it's fascinating what, you know, another aspect of this is religion. Catholic Church is being undermined in Europe, and yet the caliphate is being undermined in the Middle East. It's all going on at the same time. What a jumbled mass. Yes?
If a woman wasn't allowed to own property, what would happen if she became a widow?
I guess that depends on state law, the individual state laws. Not being a lawyer, I don't think I can competently answer that question. If someone here is a lawyer who knows that sort of history, I mean, speak up.
In New York State, they were allowed to own businesses and property. So I don't know beyond that. Back in the 1830s.
Yeah, I guess some of the states, New York was, if you want to call it more liberal or progressive, that's the proper term, progressive at the time.
In some states, a male relative was given the power
Yes.
of attorney or power of, to take care of the widow's property.
Yeah,
It would be the brother of the husband.
right.
And if the oldest child was old enough, it would go to the oldest son.
You know, that's interesting too, because if
That's the way it is in Muslim countries too. in some ways.
well, if you read the Quran, women do have inheritance rights. But that doesn't mean the Taliban and the Islamic State are going to abide. You know how some people are, they cherry pick what they want out of their religion. You know how that works. And so the Taliban and Islamic State, you think they're going to want women to have property rights? I don't think so. I don't think so. And so, you know, when we talk about the Muslims this way, yeah, you get into the Quran, you sometimes you see things you're not finding in your press. It's like anything else. So. Oh, fake news. Here we go. Here we go. Yes.
So England and other perhaps European countries are giving up slavery when it comes to the colonies, like in Africa, what Belgium did with their slaves, and Germany, and so they still had slavery, but just not in their own country.
That's one way of looking at it. I mean, you know, up to before the Berlin Conference of 1885, 1886. I mean, keep in mind, Otto von Bismarck did not want Germany in the colonial game. His feeling was Germany's future is as a political and economic monolith. If the British and the French want to go after colonies, let them, especially the French, they're out of our hair. We don't want a large navy, but he was under pressure too, and Germany will get involved in the colonial game. But when it came to Africa, I mean, up to this point, maybe 10-12% of Africa was under the colonial heel. After that conference, by 1900, some 90% was. So yeah, if you want to look at it, that they transferred slavery from Europe, instead of taking the people out, let's just take their resources. Yeah, it's the same sort of, I guess you could say it's the same sort of thing. So yeah. Of course, what is that going to do? And because you're seeing the same thing in Southeast Asia, where the French went there, and the British did the same thing in Iraq, you know, this idea of consigning the mass of the peasantry to indentured servitude and then cater to a restricted clique of landowners. In Iraq, it's the tribal sheikhs. In Vietnam, it was the French colons plus a restricted clique of Vietnamese who were well endowed financially, owned a lot of the land. And so you are going to see, as you advance through the 20th century, and the British and French empires are going, that these revolutionary nationalist movements, some of it based on land, they're going to catch fire by the end of the war. I'm talking 1945. Ho Chi Minh comes to mind here. Mao Zedong comes to mind here. Yeah. So what's happening in the 19th, going into the 20th century, is going to influence what's going to happen after 45, when the British and French empires are going down. In fact, what you are seeing now is still residue of that. So, yes?
What position did Frederick Douglass take after the war on linking the demand for women's suffrage, black male suffrage?
To tell you the truth, I didn't get into that end of this. I stuck, you know, when the war was over, mostly with just Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. As far as I know, he was a social reformer as well as being an abolitionist, fighting for the black man's rights. But after the war, to be honest with you, I don't know. It's a good question. It's a good question. Very good question. Anybody else have any questions or comments? Yes?
I was just wondering about like her personal writings or the people that researched this topic, Susan B. Anthony.
Right.
What if there was a reliable primary literature to see, you know, what she was thinking sort of personally? It seems like she was not afflicted with any setbacks due to what you would imagine would be resistance wherever she went. And even though the logistics of how she got 400,000 votes on a petition
Right.
at that time,
Right. 1863.
how would that be accomplished?
Yeah.
And if she wrote about that, or
She really wasn't, she wrote letters, but she wasn't a prolific writer with regards to books or anything of that nature. Elizabeth Cady Stanton really was the intellectual mind behind this. Susan B. Anthony, one of her saving graces is that she was supposedly a wonderful speaker. Of course, we don't have transcripts, you know, movies. Which brings to mind, in this respect, Helen Keller, who we did have movies of. as a speaker, being blind and deaf. One tragic aspect of that is when those planes hit the Twin Towers, the National Archives and Records Administration had some of their records at the Twin Towers. And so some of Helen Keller's records were lost. Yeah. And so, but Susan B. Anthony made her mark. One of her strong points was as a speaker. And so when she was giving like 75 to 100 talks a year, you know, considering you're moving by a horse and buggy,
Yeah.
and considering that sometimes she was doing this in the dead of winter in New York, yeah, that's a lot of talks.
Yeah, she visited every single county in upstate New York in one winter.
Yeah, yeah, and that's determination. That's being wedded to the cause, and you have to be that. I mean, read that quote that I have on the face of that handout. She's an inspiring character. She really is. She really is. All these women are, in their own right. Of course, you know, again, when you talk about these women, and I'll get to this when we do Amelia Earhart, is with Amelia Earhart, there's no closure. Maybe. There's really
They had
no.
those fake pictures that came out, I think, a couple
Yeah,
months
they're
ago.
always coming up with something.
But even Japan at that time wasn't at war with the United States.
Well, you know, Gore Vidal one time, when he got to know Eleanor Roosevelt after the war, and because Eleanor Roosevelt and Amelia Earhart were friends, and he says, "Is there any truth to the fact that she was spying on the Japanese in '37?" And she says, "Well, as you might expect, I had an investigation done, and that's just not true." That's no. But again, with Amelia Earhart, there's no closure here, as there is with Susan B. Anthony or Amelia Earhart or even Eleanor Roosevelt. But in their own right, they help push the woman's agenda. And the agenda of rights for everybody, when you think about it in the end. I mean, that's basically what they're doing here. If you look at Susan B. Anthony, not just the black man's rights, not just the woman's rights, we want rights across the board. And so, it's interesting here. I mean, these people stuck their necks out. And you gotta give them credit for this. You gotta give them credit for what they accomplished. Yes, ma'am?
Do we know what her audience was when she was giving all these speeches? Were they primarily women? Were they men? Mixed?
Both, but there was a lot of women. A lot of women. I mean, some of these women are going to latch on to this, especially with the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. And then especially when you go to Europe and then put the American and European agenda together with this International Council of Women. This is taking off. In fact, if my numbers are correct, when they had the Second International Council of Women at the Chicago World's Fair, they had 150,000 people show up for all these meetings when they tallied it all up. There's something going on here. So yeah, interesting, fascinating, fascinating. But again, society itself is changing, and not just here. So yes.
As you were talking, I was recalling that I saw her name and portrait on a coin. You don't know which one it is?
Yeah, the Susan B. Anthony dollar
Yeah.
that had the funny edges to it. Yeah.
That's right. You don't see them around now.
No, you don't. Unless you've got them in a collection, or you hoarded them. Yeah.
Well, they use them at Grand Central Station.
Yeah.
You know what year that
You get a
was?
ticket.
79.
Yeah. But then, yeah, and
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Okay, good.
yeah. So yeah, but that was part of that initiative to remember women. I mean, who was it that was running for office not in around that time? What was her name? She ran for vice president. Geraldine Ferraro. Yeah, I think it's around the same time. When she was running as vice. In fact, believe it or not, when the Second World War was over, there were some who would have favored putting Eleanor Roosevelt's name as a VP. That didn't happen. A little early for that yet. So, yeah. But again, it goes back to my wife was saying 30 years ago when we were in our earlier years of our marriage. Black man will be president before a woman will. Okay.
She should lecture.
On that note.
Well, on that note, with those earlier lectures, well, you brought it up before, those earlier lectures I did like in the Middle East, Vietnam, these real uplifting talks here about what's going on there. Hey, you're going back to the Wallingford Library? Yeah, gee whiz, like people want to sit there for an hour and listen to Mr. Sunshine for. So, somebody like a Susan B. Anthony is more of a sunshine speech. We're not talking about, Iraq or Vietnam or something like that. So. Yes, sir.
Can I ask you, did she ever get paid for her speech?
Yes. That's for the most part how she made her living. And keep in mind, as she was becoming more popular, when she went to Washington, D.C., she was of such stature that the Riggs Hotel would whenever they had a convention for women there, would set aside some suites for her free of charge. Yeah. But she did live somewhat of a Spartan life. And another thing I found fascinating about her is her ability to perhaps understand the emotional aspect of an audience. When she was tearing herself, and again, a guy comes to mind here. I've been giving talks on him, Edward Bernays. Ever hear of him?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, he's a fascinating character. But again, some people who are really professional speakers get to understand the emotional aspects of their audience. And perhaps she was one. As she was breaking out of that Quaker shell, dropping thee and thou, and wearing more stylish garb, as a young speaker, young woman here, 31, 33, 35, she began to wear the pantaloon dresses, the bloomer dresses, where the women had the knee-length dress, but the pantaloons. Yeah. And she found out that when she was wearing that style of garb, when she was talking, maybe some of these reporters would focus on what she was wearing and taking away from the message. She stopped wearing those clothes. Interesting here. Interesting. Fascinating. Yeah, right. Yeah, okay. Yeah. And so she began to I need to make sure people focus on the message, not what I'm wearing. How would that go over today? With some people.
Not too well with fonts.
And so, yeah, it's interesting. Interesting. In fact, I made a note of that in my notes. It seemed like she was beginning as a speaker. You begin to pick up a few things, and maybe she picked this up. That I want people to focus on my message, not what I'm wearing. And I bring up Edward Bernays because Edward Bernays, as a man who was, he was picked by George Creel, the Creel Commission of World War I, to be one of the he was one of the headliners of the Committee for Public Information, and he helped sell the First World War to the American public as a war being fought for democracy. He was a nephew of Sigmund Freud. Yeah, torches. That's interesting. With the women's movement, they tapped into this when he was working for Lucky Strike cigarettes, calling cigarettes torches of freedom, and women ought to smoke them. I think I'm kidding. And he fashioned his propaganda of the thin, good-looking woman smoking the cigarette. Yeah. Yeah, George Washington Hill of American Tobacco will hire him, and he will sell. Bernays will help sell millions upon millions upon millions of Lucky Strike cigarettes. But he got more and more women. This was an example of the woman pushing her agenda. Well, smoke. Yet at the same time, Edward Bernays didn't smoke, and he tried to get his wife off smoking. Yeah. Interesting here. Interesting. A little tidbit about the women's movement. Smoking. Wow. Yeah.
Long way, baby.
Yeah, come a long way, baby, yeah. Interesting, fascinating. Anybody else have any questions or comments? I guess we're done. You're welcome. Thank you.